What's up, guys? Hope you're doing well. Man, I don't know about everybody other than the ones I've heard from, but this has been an incredible series of conversations, and we're not even halfway through it yet. But this year, I've had the privilege, and I'm kind of, selfishly, I hate to say it this way, but I'm blessed, and I'm so lucky to get to sit in this chair because I've got to have a bunch of conversations with one of the guys that I've looked up to most of all of my adult life, it seems like, Dr. Bill Brown, who has agreed to serve as the SLU Scholar in Residence. Now, before I introduce our topic for this week, I want to take just a minute and say, please, if you wouldn't mind, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take a moment to do so. Number two, the purpose of conversation is that there is a two-way street in dialogue. And that doesn't just mean Dr. Brown and I. What that means is also you are involved in that conversation. And so through the amazing geniuses who have created all this wonderful technology, we have the ability to dialogue in the chat below. So if you want to challenge something that is said, if you have a question about, hey, would you go deeper on this? Or maybe have you ever thought about it from this angle? Or if maybe a question just stirs up more questions, or maybe you just have a thought, I'm going to ask that you go ahead and engage down below in the chat area and leave a comment. Dr. Brown will respond. Give him a little bit of time, but he'll respond to the comments. He is here to engage in these types of questions and conversations. So I just want to take a quick moment here at the beginning of the time and say, make sure you're subscribed and make sure you're entering into a conversation with us. That's what this is. That's the purpose of these conversations. So we can't wait to dialogue with you as we continue on with the different topics that we're going to be covering this year. So, Doc, here we go again.
Yes.
This one is probably, I'm going to introduce the topic in just a minute, but before I do, would you say this is probably your favorite topic that we're going to cover?
Oh, probably.
It is synonymous with Dr. Bill Brown. And so what we're going to talk about is the importance of a worldview, how a worldview functions, and how knowing about worldview can enhance someone's ability to minister well to students. Mm-hmm. And so so let's just start at the beginning.
Okay.
What is a worldview?
A worldview is a person's understanding of the world and how they explain it and their place in it. Mm-hmm. That's basically it. Mm-hmm. And it's something that everybody has. It gets misused a lot, particularly among Christians. A lot of Christians will say, well, I want to talk about the biblical worldview.
Yes, sir.
So we're going to teach the Bible, as if teaching the Bible is what a biblical worldview actually is. Mm-hmm. But that's not it. And we'll kind of take it apart a little bit as we go on here. But that's basically it. Everybody has one. Mm-hmm. Whether you know it or not, and by decision or default, you do have a worldview. And so that's a good starting point if you're working with young people.
Basically, a worldview is what shapes your understanding of reality. Mm-hmm. And so if that's the case, man, the benefits and the consequences are pretty significant when we talk about both understanding a worldview and knowing how to teach students and equip students and disciple students and come along students and witness to students, and everything we do in student ministry should be filtered through our understanding of worldview. And yes, in a moment we'll talk about it. What does it mean to really have a Christian worldview? Yeah. And but it's always important. Why is it so important right now that we have this conversation?
Well, I think, particularly for young people, let's focus on that. And the way sometimes we word a worldview is that the fact that we have already answered these questions mm-hmm. about meaning and morality and all those other, we've already really answered them by the way that we live. And we're surprised that we have a worldview, and that's my worldview. I was in Russia lecturing outside of Moscow, and afterwards this faculty member came up from the university and said, according to you, I'm a naturalist. We'll talk about that as an atheist. He was an astrophysicist, which was cool. And then I said, okay, you're a naturalist. And he looked away for a while and came back and said, I don't know if I want to be a naturalist. And then walked away. But see, he had a worldview, but he'd never heard the concept, hadn't thought about it. And there's three major worldview categories. We'll talk about that too. And the just unveiling that for him was there. It was really important. And say once we do that, and once youth pastors start having young people start thinking those categories, then they start seeing things make sense.
Yeah, and so for a student pastor, this is important because if you're not intentional about helping someone understand reality, then you're not going to be effective as a pastor, as a minister, as somebody who's called to come alongside students. So, I mean, this is kind of something that plays for keeps, right? It really can have some big consequences if we're not intentional with this.
Well, and the opportunities to do this is important because who's teaching worldview?
Yeah.
Anywhere.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And the idea that you can have young people and help them begin to think through that everybody thinks like this. Everybody has a perspective of life in the world and how they're supposed to live, what happens when you die, all those kinds of things. And it does shape the way that you see the world around you and the person you're becoming.
You know, I'm going to ask you to answer this question, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to think about your answer. I'll throw one of mine out real quick, but I'd like us to talk about what are some practical consequences if we don't do this. And here's the reason I do this right now in any form of communication, whether it's just giving a speech or preaching a sermon or teaching a lecture, whatever it is. You always want to take a moment at the beginning and raise the need. Like, here's why this is important. And one of the ways you do that is go, hey, like, there are consequences to not understanding this. One of the consequences to not having a sacred intentionality about thinking through worldview, in my opinion, is that you lose the ability to think critically about really important issues in life. You lose the ability to, you hear stuff and you go, well, I guess so. You don't really you lose the ability, or you don't create that muscle in your brain where you can kind of challenge an idea, challenge a thought, question a question even. And so critical thinking kind of gets marginalized if we're not intentional with this conversation.
Yeah, because you got to have some criteria in order to think critically, in order to evaluate what's being said, what's being lived, and so on. If you don't, then everything that's in culture right now, everything that bothers us in society, it's all free floating.
Right.
And you've got teenagers, and, LGBTQ floats by them, trans floats by them, and all of the things that they find that, that Buddhist idea was really, really pretty good, you know. Or I just listened to Richard Dawkins talking, and all that's floating around them, and they're going to pick, But when you think worldviewishly, you have the four major categories of what forms a worldview, and then you start saying, okay, that belongs here, that belongs here.
Yeah.
That makes sense, that doesn't make sense, you know. And so not doing that, you've got people with their minds everywhere, just like you said, the critical thinking just goes out the window because there's no means by which we can think critically at all.
And Paul instructs us to think critically. He says test everything. Those two little words.
Test everything. And you're testing it with something.
Yes, sir.
Right.
Yes, sir. So you mentioned there's 4 criteria. What are those?
Well, you could use, there's like maybe 13, we call them ultimate questions, but I like the big 4, which is origin.
By the way, thank you for those of us lay people who don't want 13, but just give me 4. Thank you, Doc.
Okay,
Appreciate that.
Right. I know your limit. Okay. Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. That is, origin, where did everything come from?
Yeah.
Meaning, why was it created? Why are we here? Morality, how you decide what's right and wrong. And then finally, destiny, what happens when and after we die. And where is everything going? Those 4, everybody has really answered those questions, whether they realize it or not. Sometimes when I'm on a plane or talking with somebody, I'll mention those things. Well, what do you think about those things? Like, what do you think happens when you die? And so, I don't know, but, and some will have various views of their parents or something they saw on television or something like that. I believe that this happens and this happens. And that, believe it or not, just begins to formulate the way they view life in the world.
I'm going to throw something out and correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you love me too much to let me just float a dumb idea. But as you were saying that, those 4 categories, I'm thinking back on all of my education, and I spent quite a few classes in systematic theology and biblical theology, those two disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that we studied falls under those one of those four categories.
It's true.
So is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, right.
Wow.
It is. It is. And because when the scriptures speak, I always like to say God doesn't stutter when he speaks because he's giving us what is important to not only understand him, but to live it out.
Yes, sir.
And those four character qualities are seen in how you answer those four questions.
Have you ever walked alongside a pastor as you were breaking down those four categories? And here's the reality. I'm not going to pretend like I haven't heard those before. I've heard you teach that before. But the beauty of hearing some things over and over again is it helps you foster new questions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions that popped in my head as you were breaking that down is, have you ever walked alongside a pastor to help him plan like his preaching and teaching calendar? Because to me, you go, those four categories you need to pay attention to that in your teaching and in your content, whatever your content is that you're delivering every calendar year,
Mm-hmm.
So have you ever done that for somebody?
Yeah, with some, because a lot of times when they read a book and start getting into worldview thinking or go through the Colson Fellows program, those kinds of things, where they start seeing through the lens of that, they'll say, okay, that means when I'm speaking from this, let's say Genesis 1, in the beginning God created. Well, once you say that, you've kind of answered the other three questions. God created everything, therefore there is a meaning, and therefore there is a morality because he decides, and there is something that he does at the end of life and so on. And but once you take that away, then you're free floating again in all those cases. So what I encourage them to do is every time you come up to something in the scriptures which addresses one of these four areas, it's a good time to step back for the congregation, say, now let's look, this is what we believe and so on, but let us look at how culture around us would disagree. And we'll see that manifested in this movie. We'll see that manifested in these songs. We'll see that manifested in these political statements that are being made or these laws that are passed. And it starts allowing them to help them to begin to discern what's going on in culture around them.
I would think it would also help as these four categories in conversations with non-believers. Like, for example, most of the objections to Christianity the conversation is going to start with morality. Well, you guys believe this, or you guys think this, and I don't believe that. I believe in this. And so we'll take a very basic example. Most Christians believe that abortion is immoral and wrong. But if I'm sitting on the plane next to somebody who engages me in conversation, or I engage them, and what do you think about abortion? Well, what do you think about it? And they go, well, I think it's a woman's rights. Well, I don't know if I agree with you. But before we even have that conversation, that's part of a larger thing that's going on called my worldview. And the one thing I know we have in common is that there's four questions we all care about. And those questions, obviously, like you said, origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, or eternity. And so what it allows me to do is go, I know we want to talk about the morality, but can I tell you how I got here? And let's go back to the beginning. And that's an incredible way of engaging someone in conversation and pointing them to truth.
Right. And I think that when we do that, we are dignifying them as being created in the image and likeness of God, your worldview. So once you say, I believe that God created all of us in his image and likeness, which were informed by the scriptures, but generally with God created us, therefore, I have to honor you because you are so, and you have to honor me. Yeah. And but that reality means that people that we disagree with, or maybe even considered our enemies, we have to dignify them because they are created in the image and likeness of God. And don't forget, Jesus said several times, almost irritatingly, love your enemies.
Yeah.
Do good to those who hate you. Those kinds of things. And why does he say that? How could Jesus say that? Is he just saying, I want you to roll over and let the world run over you? No, you're doing it because he created them.
Yeah.
And doing that opens up more opportunities for you to represent Christ to them than if you were going to start right with abortion. And I have a better argument than you do for that. Yeah.
Let's not start where lightning strikes.
Yeah.
Lightning strikes, that's the abortion question or the morality question, whatever the morality issue may be. Let's start with where the lightning comes from.
Yeah.
And so
good point. That's good.
But you mentioned that Jesus really exemplified this when he told us to love our enemies, and then he adds to that you know what, the Lord's going to send rain to the good and the evil, and that's because he values what he has stamped as infinitely valuable, which is the crown of his creation, mankind. So it's effective. These questions are effective in informing us how we teach, and these questions are effective in informing how we go about sharing our faith and having spiritual conversations. Okay, those are the four. Okay, there's three kind of macro categories for worldview. What are they?
Right. I call them. Basically, we call them the big worldview categories. Now, underneath each one of these, there are a lot of manifestations of it. But the more obvious ones are, for example, what we call naturalism. That is, everything is natural, nothing is supernatural. Everything is physical, nothing is metaphysical. And that is, there is no God, there are no spirits, there are no angels, and all you are is a physical being. You have a beginning and an end, and that's it. Therefore, that informs what we believe about morality, for example, or meaning. There is no meaning.
Right.
In fact, I was reading a book, a science book yesterday, and it basically said the outcome of science is that life has no meaning. Universe has no meaning. And you can't say anything else other than that. Morality, well, we decide somehow or another we're going to figure it out. And every culture has that challenge, and every culture in their time will do that. And then, of course, destiny, we're destined to die and be gone, and that's it.
So the major, I would think, subcategories of naturalism would be agnosticism and atheism.
Basically, right. And you have physicalism and scientism and so on, which are very similar to those, but they have different ways of looking at how you go about finding knowledge, how you determine morality, and so on.
And what's the next one?
The next one is called transcendentalism, which is a long word, but what it basically says that true reality transcends the physical. That is, there's a reality, and in some forms of extreme Buddhism would say that the human body is not real. Reality is the spirit that is within. You are a part of the great oneness, and being in a body is a bad thing. And because in your body you have desires, and those desires make you want things, and the desires make you suffer. Because the first noble truth of Buddhism, for example, is life is suffering. Suffering's caused by desires, and so on. And so what happens then, you try to get rid of the physical nature of the anxiety that you have, and you try to live a life in harmony with everything else. Because you are part of the oneness, and everybody else is as well. And you find that in what we call the transcendental religions of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, et cetera, New Age movement, for example, back in the day, and so on. And so there's no personal God, but everything is divine in a very impersonal sort of way. And I have a lot of my family holds to those beliefs, and the idea being that when you get incarnated, you die, then you can come back again. And it may be like, for example, in Hinduism, where you move up the scale of life, until ultimately, when you die, maybe 1,012th time, then you are no longer embodied, and you're free, and you lose your personality, you lose your personal awareness, etc., and you're back in the one.
This is, first of all, that sounds like a very miserable way to live. That to begin with, all there is suffering. That's what life is. It's just suffering. This is going to sound crazy, but I was watching a documentary that had to do with something, and they brought in this occult historian, and he was explaining how there was this time, before the hippie movement, before New Ageism, before some of the things that we would call New Age, where there was this kind of, we would call it Satanism and Satan worship, but it was evil, and it was Pentagon, all the evil symbolism and rituals and things like that. And then he said there was a kind of a splintering, those who wanted to go even darker and those who wanted to go lighter. And what came out of that was the lighter version was what morphed into New Ageism, which informed much of the hippie movement and became, then got a lot of traction in the hippie movement, had a good, probably we would say a good run for another 15 years after that. Still exists today, but not as fluent as it was. And then, but is that a fair assessment of history and how these worldviews have kind of materialized in our culture, in the Western culture?
Yeah, well, Western culture tends to be haunted by Christianity, and haunted by the reality of God's existence. And I think what we Westerners have tried to do has to take that sense of there being an impersonal power that is, we'll call God, or the universe. That's popular nowadays. You thank the universe for this, thank the universe for that, and so on. And light and dark, very, very clearly, it splits up. But it's still this sense of a spiritual existence, And the darkness is not as prevalent as it used to be. There were some really weird things going on in mainly the mid to later part of the 60s. Which has continued on in some. And, of course, you go to a lot of movies where you've got the dark power or whatever it is like that. And it's a scary version. But the people don't think, well, that's Satan and this is God. They just think that's the yin and the yang idea, the light and the dark of whatever we call the one.
Yeah. So you got naturalism, which everything is material and nothing matters. You got transcendentalism, where anything that matters is immaterial. What's the third category?
The third category is theism, from a broad perspective, mainly that the Creator was a personal God who brought everything into existence, and in many ways it patterns Him. Yeah. He is a person, has a personality, and so do we. And everything is orderly, so is He, and that He created everything in one way or another to reflect Him. And I think in order to have us with Him, and He created us for Him. And those are some beautiful truths, and it's played out in the Garden of Eden, as we see. The idea of theism as there being a personal God, most people would probably identify the three major theistic religions of Christianity and of Judaism and Islam being, and
certainly those would be the three largest monotheistic.
Oh, clearly, and there are some smaller groups, but by and large, Judaism has really did not morph into Christianity, but sometimes it sits on its own, but it was really the foundation, God working through that. And Islam being, 6 centuries after Christ, being from the Arab under Muhammad, taking both of Judaism and Christianity and many of the Arab superstition religions and putting it together into
it really was a melting pot.
It was quite a melting pot, yeah.
As you were talking, and I just, in my brain automatically goes to conversations with people who are unbelievers, and I was thinking, for some people it's a big leap to get to theism. For example, C.S. Lewis, who I know you love, had to get to theism before he could get to Jesus.
Right.
And actually got on his knees in his apartment. There's a book that is titled by this quote from Lewis, and he got on his knees and recognized that there was a God to be known, though he didn't quite know this God yet. And he called himself that night the most reluctant convert in all of England, That's
a great story.
And it's a great story. And then there's that book, The Most Reluctant Convert, that is patterned after his spiritual journey. But it's important that we're articulating these categories, because everybody's journey to Jesus is just that. It's a journey. And some people have to stop off and go. Some people are going to sit and listen and go, man, I'm just running into the arms of Jesus. But there are some people that process more. There are some people that go, you know what, I'm not quite there yet, but I'll give you this. There's a pretty good argument here for a personal God. So these categories are helpful in not just helping us understand how to process the world around us, but also to understand the journey that people are on. Is that a fair assessment?
No, that's great. I know a lot of people, both personally and by reputation, who were staunch atheists, and then something happened in their life. Sometimes it was a very negative thing, or sometimes it was a good thing. Having a baby for several of these people that I know, having that baby made them go, "Whoa, life's a little bit different than I thought." And but they don't turn to God; they turn to the spiritual. Okay, there is a spiritual realm, and so on. And I rejoice when I see that, because I know that if that keeps going, they're going to begin to more and more open themselves up to the personal God, because I believe God really pursues everybody through His love.
Amen.
And like I said, I know a lot of people, and there are some well-known people out, I won't mention their name right now, that are going through that right now. And people I pray for, celebrities and some others. And when I hear them say certain things, I'll go, yep, and just pray that continues.
I'm spiritual but not religious. That phrase has almost been copyrighted and coined, and books been written after it. But so that's it really is a category of thinking. And I don't know. I just have always thought, that idea of this isn't just categories, but also a lot of people's journey, because then they go from I'm spiritual but not religious to something happens in their life, like a child is born or something, and they go, I need some clarity on this. And that's what maybe brings them to a place where, there might be a personal God. It's one more step towards God. And then they're positioned to go, man, maybe I should consider the teachings and the person and the work of Jesus. And so it is amazing to see that it's sometimes not just categories, but also can be somebody's journey. Well, I remember I was 18 years old, maybe 19 years old, listening to you teach some of these categories. And even for a knucklehead like me that didn't pay attention really well, I knew those three: naturalism, transcendentalism, theism, and you taught it in such a way that I couldn't read a book, I couldn't watch a movie, I couldn't watch a show, I couldn't listen to a song. You always were, I wonder what this represents, because you see it in everything after that. So I always credit you for ruining all the entertainment that I would ever in future enjoy. So, but help us to understand how, like this is like you watch a movie or you read a book or you see a show or you see a play or you hear a story. Like worldview is these you should pretty quickly you can recognize. Oh, this is going to fall into the category of naturalism, or this is going to fall into the category of transcendentalism or theism. Tell us what that looks like.
Well, it's more along the lines of every person, we're creating God's image and likeness, and we create songs that have never existed before. We create paintings of things that don't exist, that are beautiful and moving and so on. And animals don't do that on purpose. I mean, a spider web looks awesome, but it's not like the spider web's going, now let me think, No, but we do
this
things.
This is my blue period.
Yeah. I was going to say something I wasn't. But the reality is, as we create those things, we elicit emotions from people, and so on. And why is that? Because it's touching a very deep part of our own existence. And so, for example, I did this with my first youth group, my first and only youth group, back when I was in grad school. And I'd have them bring in their favorite songs, and we put the words up on the screen, and we'd listen to them. And there were some really good songs. There were some. There was a couple by Megadeth.
I remember that back in the day.
Oh gosh! And so I had them. Okay, you've heard the music, and sort of the type of music it was, the genre in which it was, written and sung and performed, and all of that was part of it. But then you listen, look at the words. What are they saying? And I'd have them say, okay, what is this song telling you to do? What's it telling you to believe? What does it say the good life is? Those kinds of questions. And after a while, they got really good at it. And they began to see that a song's just not a song,
right,
but it is reflecting a particular worldview, a particular way to look at the world and your place in it. And one of my favorite stories is a young lady several years after I had left the grad school, and I came back to the Texas area, and I saw her, and she took my hand and said, without even saying hi, she said, "You ruined my music listening." As you kind of intimated.
I wasn't the only one.
Yeah, but the idea being, but she loved it. She says that discernment, because if you go through and you don't have those categories to think through, like we said earlier, everything's just floating around. Oh, I like that song. I like that sound. But it's filled with a lot of horrible things. Well, that's it, But the reality is that we can, in one way or another, be able to identify worldviews in most everything that we produce.
Going back to Paul's statement, test everything. These kind of broad categories, naturalism, transcendentalism, theism, really help you to think and live with a sacred sense of intentionality.
Mm-hmm.
That's whenever I've told people, like, that's how I'm trying to process what I'm seeing and what's coming at me. It really is. I come back to that phrase. It's this sacred sense of intentionality that is afforded to me because I have these categories by which to understand other people's messaging and worldviews. But you said there's some horrible stuff in there. But sometimes recognizing worldview doesn't cause us to run away. It's like, no, this is a pretty good way to learn. I remember sitting in a class, and somebody, you were explaining how Star Wars, and of course this was before we only had episode 4, 5, and 6 at this time.
The glory days.
The glory days, back when movies were movies. But somebody said, well, if that's transcendentalism, the Force is kind of this impersonal, spiritual but not, material, well, then we probably shouldn't watch Star Wars. And I'm in a way that you it's so really gracious and kind that you do. You looked at her and went, well, I've shown my kids Star Wars to teach them what transcendentalism is, and it was very disarming the way you did it. But it just because there's an alternate worldview that is represented. Doesn't mean that we have to flee that. There might be something to be learned there, or gleaned, or even can I say even enjoyed? Is that okay? Because I like Star Wars.
Yeah. Well, see, that's the best part. Once you understand what the underlying message is and the worldview is, it's almost like you take away its power. It can't get into your mind and soul because that's not my worldview. However, I see that worldview, and I understand why people have that worldview, and so on. And the story is good, and so on. In fact, if it had been written with a Christian perspective, I'm not sure how you would have done that, but it may not have been as good. But the reality is just recognizing it. And I like the way you talked about the intentionality, because I think that's something that's really missing in a lot of youth ministry. Or maybe they're over-intentional, But the idea being, we want you to be able to walk through life and be able to understand what's going on around you, what's going on inside of yourself, and recognize who you are created in God, recognize you have a meaning and purpose in life, and et cetera. All of those things that make life full, The fact that 90% of young people in Britain, for example, who are teenagers in their early 20s will say, that life has no meaning. My life has no purpose. And that survey came out. It was just shocking. And we're no different over here.
Sure.
We haven't done surveys on it, probably a good thing. But if you're a young person, you believe that your life has no meaning or purpose, and life has no meaning or purpose, you're going to live a certain way.
Yeah. And
that's why we see the anxiety and the stress and even the suicide and the identity, challenge that everybody has. It's difficult. And so
you just mentioned that's why we see the anxiety and to mention a book that just came out, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. I don't know if you had a chance to read that.
I have not really. I'm familiar.
He
with
wrote
it.
the book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Yeah, exactly.
And
that's a good one.
The Coddling of the American Mind was, based on the evidence thus far, this is what we think. The Anxious Generation is kind of like him going, no, now it's scientifically proven that and he's primarily talking about the impact of social media on kids, on children and teenagers. And so this idea of, if you were to look at social media and how it has caused so much anxiety, it's not just that someone's seeing a lot of different reels or TikTok videos or messages, or it's that they're getting 100 different things thrown at them that's just, like you said, floating. And it's, if you don't have a way to process, it can just create this groundswell of anxiety is kind of how if I look at Haight's research, and really it's his research, but he's summarizing a lot of other research. If I look at that and then I couple this with your conversation or what you're teaching me, I'm going, oh my gosh, it's not just I see too much stuff and that makes me ADHD. It's not just that. Mm-hmm. It's that there's so much coming at me and I have no way to process all this.
Right.
And so if I have no way to process it, one of the consequences of not doing this is that you open yourself up to all that anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts and aloneness and on the list of mental illnesses go as a result of this. So I guess that leads me to this question. Okay, you got a youth ministry practitioner, somebody who cares deeply about this next generation, and they're going, okay, Doc, how do I incorporate this into my teaching? How do I incorporate this in how I'm leading the ministry that God has entrusted to me? What would you say to that question?
Well, this is where I think the challenge is, and parents need to be involved, I think, in a very positive way too. But to find out from the kids what is troubling them, what have you heard, and so on, and let them ask questions. And if they don't, then let the youth pastor ask the questions for them. There's enough material out there where you can say, I know you've heard this. I mean, by age 14 or 15, every one of those Generation Z have seen pornography. I mean, every one of them. And it's difficult for them to process a lot of that, particularly some of the more salacious forms of pornography that are available to them, free, And where do they process it? With friends, maybe? And it's just, so they almost automatically start leading the silent, quiet life of just horrible kinds of things. And so youth pastor, just knowing all of those things, needs to start addressing those things and then giving the positive perspective and letting them talk about it and being able to speak into all of that from the scriptures, what God has for them and so on. And that helps a lot, not completely, but that helps so much, give them some hope, because a lot of kids are just hopeless, and that's where that anxiety comes in. It's like, I can't deal with this, all these things I'm seeing and hearing, and it's just overwhelming. And I'll go to youth group, though, and we'll just sit there, we'll sing the songs, and then we'll leave. You kids have any questions? And they're just sitting there. They got lots of them.
They do.
But it's terrifying to ask them like that.
One of the ways I facilitated questions when I was a youth pastor, and I'm not technologically creative, so I had to get a couple folks to help me with this. But for Wednesday nights, I did this more than once. We would turn it into kind of a game show vibe. And I would have, but I would do this after. Like, I would take a few weeks and I would teach through, taught through the categories, taught through the 4 questions, taught through the 3 big categories, naturalism, transcendence. It used illustrations in my sermon so that they understood. We had small group discussion around it. But in a way to help foster more conversation, after we did some of that series, I did a night where it was like a game show. And I had contestants, which were my students. And they had been drafted ahead of time. They weren't like surprised in the moment, like, oh my gosh, I don't want to talk in front of anybody. No, I asked them ahead of time and they agreed. And so I'd have several contestants, and we did this game show where I would show a clip or play a verse of a song or did something, and I would stop it real abruptly and go, okay, name that worldview. And they would, and it was almost like a Jeopardy thing where you got points and you got, and nice. And it was a way of making worldview accessible for the larger room, and it was creative, I thought. But what it did, and I didn't realize it would do, is everybody saw themselves on stage as one of the contestants, and it fostered conversation. There's a lot of creative ways to get students to start asking questions.
That's right.
That was one of my favorite ways I did it. We'd do it a couple times a year. How do we do? How would you suggest? If somebody's listening to this, let's say they volunteer. They work a 40-hour week, 45-hour week, and they're hustling in the margins to kind of create a message or some programming or whatnot. How would you encourage that next gen leader to foster conversation in the context of that student ministry?
Of course, the best way is to dive in yourself and start looking at what they're looking at, seeing what they're seeing, and hearing what they're hearing, and then bring it to church. When we would do Worldview team, for example, we'd go into a church and
explain what that is, because that was another very, very creative way of teaching this stuff.
A Worldview team was where we would go into a church. We get invited, and I brought usually 4 or so students with me, college students with me, and we would talk about worldviews, and I would lecture. I don't know if I call myself lecturing, but talk about the 3 major worldviews, and then we give examples, and I would let the college students explain. Okay, you see this song here, and it is. Notice this line here and this line here. This is giving us a transcendental worldview here, or a film clip from Seinfeld, and the idea being nothing matters. Everything, nothing matters.
The whole premise of that show.
Nothing matters. Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And but all of those kind of things, because we're taking the things that they've seen and heard, and they're probably not Seinfeld now, but and we are helping them to X-ray it and see what it is, and then talk about it and how it relates to a Christian worldview. And youth pastors loved it.
Yeah.
For the first time, their kids are going, "Oh, this is awesome," And
a little creativity goes a long way, Doc.
It does. And youth pastors today can do certain things. In fact, I mentioned about this TikTok clip. There's a lot of these where young people, teenagers, are ranting and raving about the Bible and ranting and raving about Christians doing this and that. And I would be the kind where we're here, for worship with the youth, and we play that TikTok. Let's talk about it, because they need to hear. Because if they watch it themselves, they're going to be going, "Wow, I didn't know that," and I'm believing a lie or something. Now you're going to let's take it apart. Let's deconstruct that particular thing, and that's what youth pastors can do to help walk them through those dangerous perspectives that are coming at them all the time.
One of the things those worldview teams did also, I remember on more than one occasion, they would have mock conversations on stage.
Yeah.
And so they would and have the same conversation but represent different worldviews at times.
Yeah, right.
And that was fun because it's actually students talking to students and going, "Hey, here's what a normal conversation looks like if this is represented, or if that worldview is represented." So that was very creative. There's a lot of creative ways that a youth worker or youth pastor can begin to help a student think through the questions, think through the categories, and begin to then open up those. Personally, I think that students just knowing the categories is the first big step to fostering conversation. Let's talk about some resources for a moment, because there are some good ones out there. Is your book, Developing a Biblical Worldview, is a book that I've had. I think I've had both editions, and it's on my shelf at home. Is that still available? Can they get that on Amazon?
Yeah, it's actually called "Making Sense of Your World." And
like I said, it made a big impact on me, and
you didn't get past the cover, I know. But yeah, that's maybe a little beyond, because it is a college text.
It's an academic book, yes, sir.
And but that may be good for the youth pastor just to get to some of the basics down.
And it's called Making Sense.
Making Sense of Your World, which is, if you say, what does a worldview do? Well, it's how we make sense of the world, whether it's good or bad.
What are some other resources, whether it be books or some YouTube channels or some, just some, I know there's some even low-hanging fruit free resources that are out there.
Yeah. In fact, the Worldview team morphed into what we call Axis now.
Yep.
And I've had a hand in Axis and helping them develop their curriculum and so in fact, I was talking to the president of that, David Eaton, today, And he says, this would not be here if it wasn't for you. And I said, well, I'm going to talk about Access today a little bit. But the beautiful thing about it is they raise enough money so everything's free. They have parent guides. They have conversation kits on all of these topics, no matter how salacious they are. And a youth pastor could, show this conversation up on the screen and then talk about it and then, hand it out. It's just...
What's the thing they do? And I've been subscribed to it for years, so forgive me. I'm horrible with titles, as you just saw. But is it called the Culture Calculator?
That's so close, so close.
I was close.
The Culture Translator.
Culture Translator.
Yeah, and that comes every Friday for free. And it tells you what happened this past week in popular culture that would impact young people.
So it doesn't just help you know how to process it. It helps you stay up to date.
Yeah, they want to instruct you on how to use it. But if you go on to the access.org website, you see all of these topics and the guides that go along with it. And it's just really blowing up.
I signed up for the Friday one on social. I think that's how I
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah. But I would encourage them to check that out. And
what's some other ones?
What we do with the Colson Fellows as well. We've got all of these.
You were going to say that. The Colson Fellowship is a big one.
Yeah. We have what's called What Would You Say videos. And what would you say if a young person said to you, I think I'm gay?
Yeah.
Or what would you say that if somebody said to you that abortion does not really kill a human being? And what would you say? And all of these things. And there's, I forget how many, there's 100 of them or something. And they're good. And there's 3 major points. Each one lasts about 4 minutes. And showing those to the kids, okay, let's talk about it. Lifeway has a lot of good people too. Rebecca McLaughlin's, her stuff is fabulous.
Every book is good.
Yeah. And
even the short one she's doing, she just came out with one on
same-sex marriage.
Same-sex marriage. And not like, she produced it quickly. In other words, it wasn't fancy designed. It was like, no, we need to get this out.
Yeah.
She hasn't hit a single double or triple. It's a home run every time so far.
Yeah, in fact, I was talking to her while she was doing that. She said she just felt like we have got to do this because that's the question she gets asked the most. And but she's got a wonderful book called 10 Questions Every Teenager Should Ask and Answer About Jesus.
Every youth pastor.
And it is a great book to take your youth through, or discipleship, type of thing.
Won a bunch of awards too, though.
It won a bunch of awards.
I think Alicia Childers. Is it just the Alicia Childers podcast?
Yeah, her podcast is really good. She gets really good people on there, and she's just come out with a book on deconstruction with Tim. And
it's doing very well.
Yeah, it's doing very well. We just had a podcast on that the other night, and there's no shortage. And these youth pastors are going, I don't have time to do all that. Well, yes, you do. You need to.
Yeah.
And but work it in, because I mentioned today you should be doing reading apologetics every day. In fact, everything a youth pastor does is apologetics. You can't escape the necessity of being able to do just that.
Yeah, I think Dr. Sean McDowell's is one more, because I know a lot of our youth pastors can sit and turn on a YouTube. His YouTube channel is very helpful.
So good, so good.
Usually interviewing a scholar. Sometimes he'll just take a question and wrestle through it, but usually he's interviewing a scholar in a field and dealing with a worldview or apologetics type question. Those are some good resources. We'll put all those resources, guys, down below. There will be a link to every one of those down below. I want to ask one last kind of question, if I can, and that is, we've talked about a lot. Okay, and we've talked about a lot around one subject, but it's a lot. You've given the 4 biggest questions every human being should ask. The 3 macro categories that all worldviews fall under. We've talked about some practical ways to implement worldview into a student ministry, and we've talked about how it can be used for both preaching and teaching, but also evangelism. We've done all that, so that we've covered a lot of ground. I want you to just give me, you're really good at this, and if you don't give the statement I'm thinking of, I might throw it out there and quote you. Okay. One statement that kind of embodies everything we've been talking about and maybe even shows the importance of this.
I'll probably have to rely on you on that but I really just like the statement, making sense of the world. And because particularly nowadays, people realize that nothing seems to be making sense, and it's frightening.
Yes,
it's frightening. So what?
Well, I was going to say, I heard you say it. I've heard you say it several times, Doc. I even heard you say it today. You and I are recording this, and right next door in a big auditorium, we've been teaching 2,100 youth workers and pastors at Youth Pastor Summit. But and you said it in there, but I've heard you say it 100 times before. I've quoted you 1,000 times. And it's simply this: you may not live what you profess, but you will live what you believe. It is inescapable. And so that's probably that's one of your sticky statements, if you will, that's stuck to the side of my brain all these years. But it really does show the importance of having a sacred sense of intentionality about the worldview, about worldview questions, those big categories, those 4 questions, the bigger macro categories that all worlds you fall under. All of that equips you to be able to inform your belief, which in turn informs your living. Because theology by itself is pointless. Applied, all theology. I mean, you think about what theology is, it should be the most applicable thing in the history of the universe. I'm talking about words about God, thoughts about God, ideas about, this is the most applicable thing there is. So theology that doesn't lead to applied theology is wasted theology.
That's right.
And so all of that is summed up in your statement. You may not live what you profess, you will live what you believe. It is inescapable. That's why worldview is so important. That's why this conversation is so vital.
Also, could those who have watched this, if they have resources they use, if they have ideas of how they do it, man, please put it down below.
And put the link.
Yeah. And or describe what you do and how you do it and so on, or have questions further. Please, because our goal for this whole position is that we have some good interaction, the synergy among all of you working together for God's glory.
And so I'm going to ask us, that's a great, I'm going to ask 2 things, guys. If you're watching it, guys, when I say guys, I mean guys, gals, all of us. I'm sorry if that comes across wrong. But 2 things. One, what resources do you use to teach this or to understand it yourself? And 2, how are you teaching? Maybe it's not a resource, maybe it's a practice you have or a method you have or some creative idea you've come up with. How are you teaching students to think about worldview? And if you wouldn't mind, take a moment either right after this or hit the pause button, and would you put that in the comments down below? Because what I've learned is collaboration leads to better creativity. A lot of times people go, well, creativity, leads to collaboration is what leads us to think creatively. I think about how to do some of this stuff. So if you don't mind, would you do that on behalf of your other fellow youth workers and us who are fellow youth workers so that we can all learn together? Doc, is there anything else you want to add to this conversation?
It's good. Always enjoy time with you.
Thanks, Doc.
It's nice being face to face at this.
It is. We've been doing this on screens, right? This is a lot of fun. Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please make sure that you've subscribed to the channel. We'll be having a lot more conversations throughout the remainder of this year. If you've missed any of our conversations, you always can go back and watch those. Comment. We are looking at every conversation in the comments that are left below there as well to engage in greater conversation. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today. Until we meet again, wander well and shine like stars.